Gosbert, thanks for being on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
Of course. Well, we haven't really had the chance to really speak before this, which is good because we can really get into the nitty-gritty of things. But I wanted to start off with a bit of your background. So where did you grow up? What was your childhood like?
Yeah, sure. Okay, you threw me a bit with that question. So I'm like, I grew up, I was born here as in London. I was born in northwest London, in the great borough of Barnet, if anyone's curious, a place called Burnt Oak, which is a town name, to Tanzanian parents. So my parents came here, the African thing, they were students, came here with a dream to work and all that sort of stuff. So I grew up here, I went to school here, and obviously educated here, university. I'm one of 6 brothers and sisters, so I've got quite a large extended family. And had all the kind of, the atypical Black British experience stretching from the mid-90s up until now. So that one's really...
What actually is that, the typical Black British experience? Because I don't really understand what that means, to be honest with you. I've tried to discern what it means. I think you watch certain sitcoms or you've done certain things. But what does that mean, like the typical Black British experience?
What? I've labeled it simplistically, but it's quite complicated. So it's almost in 2 halves, isn't it? And it ebbs and flows with the change in kind of the demographics. So, growing up between kind of 2 worlds, Black British isms being heavily influenced by the Caribbean diaspora. When I was young, my friends were from like Caribbean islands.
Really?
You don't know the size of these islands because their cultural impact far outstretches how actually big they are.
Yeah.
And, that was, had friends grow up, and with that, it influences slang and kind of culture. But there's also a second half to it, which is a little more African. So, typically, when I was young, I never knew anyone who was, you had your Nigerians around. They've always been
you do, man.
They've always been a presence. They've never left. But definitely what I understand as Black Britishisms has changed, and that's almost the second half of my life with there being more Africans or more people of African descent around. I was at a business dinner when we used to go to kind of crowded dinners about a year ago, and it was titled a Black British event, and they served jollof rice, and I thought, this is game changing.
Oh man,
that would have never have happened.
That's a paradigm shift.
But I shout out to everyone who's Nigerian. You guys came with your interesting names. I have an unusual name, and the only kids in my school with unusual names were the Nigerian kids of Nigerian heritage. So yeah,
I was going to say,
we had a little
Gosbert
support network.
Is unique, right?
Yeah. I'm just at Gosbert on socials. So
okay,
the foresight by my parents, if I'm honest.
Cool, man.
Yeah.
And so when you were growing up here, what were some of the influences in your early development? Were there people that you aspired to be? What's the first thing you thought of when you were younger? Like, when I grow up, I want to be this or I want to do that.
If I'm honest, you know what? I had, my parents came here as students, and I realized that had a big impact on basically their aspirations for us as opposed to these aspirations I have for myself. So I always thought I'm going to do something important because I perceived what they were doing as important. Or, they worked in government and all that sort of stuff, civil servants. So I always thought, okay, I'm going to do something similar, right? I'm going to do something similar. And so I guess I didn't know what that was, but I knew I didn't want to be bored, whatever I'd done in the future, definitely not. And I wanted to make some sort of impact. And that word impact is particularly fluffy, and it's fluffy, I think, on purpose. But definitely I felt, I wanted to make my own mark. I know that sounds a bit corny. In terms of kind of early influences and I guess people I admired, I think like anyone, you look to kind of pop culture, which provides your ready-made heroes in the form of, footballers. And I think one of the kind of key influences was, I guess, early entrepreneurs or early stage entrepreneurs that I knew of or had heard about. And that was particularly around kind of music, either it was people kind of hosting parties, raves, all that sort of scene. There was like I'd say generally it was young Black boys and girls in London, mid to late 90s, hosting garage raves and all that sort of stuff. It was entrepreneurial. They were making money. And at that time it was like, wow, they're doing something, or they're prominent. I was never quite popular enough to kind of roll in those circles, but I definitely had an admiration of people who, perhaps made the most out of what they had and the resources they had.
Yeah, I can imagine growing up in that kind of environment. The only entrepreneurs you'd see were maybe the musicians or the sports players. Or those are the people that were highlighted, as you mentioned, ready packaged idols, or I don't even know, people to look up to, so to speak.
Yeah.
But why do you think there weren't entrepreneurs that were outside of that particular enclave of music or sports that you could look up to?
I think, firstly, like you say, it's prominence, right? They're highlighted. So they're already on a platform which makes them more visible to you. My family were entrepreneurial, but, like, I can't explain it. They were entrepreneurial in their own way,
How so?
Like, I had one of my older brothers had a range of different businesses. My parents had things on the side selling cloth, material, that sort of stuff. But it was different. Maybe there was an accessibility or resonance. As you get older, you naturally feel different to your parents. Like, I only realized recently that the upbringing that my parents had was so different to mine. And, much credit to them for even trying to navigate me through my younger years, because, I went to a normal kind of comprehensive state school here with all that entails. We're all mixed bag of experiences in one school. That was not my experience with my parents. My parents were so different. They had a totally different upbringing. And it's only now being an adult I can recognize that. I'm like, wow, like you guys did a lot to understand, like your kids basically speaking another language, this English that they're speaking to their friends, their interests, their culture, like it's totally different. So I think it was about accessibility ultimately, that there were people who were accessible who I could resonate with, as opposed to, I always had that, we've all, if you're of African heritage, you've always got that uncle who you see once in a while who's doing well.
Who comes around with a nice clean cut and a nice car. And
he's doing business. No one ever tells you what he's doing, but he's doing business. So there were always those people around, but I think in terms of accessibility, it was people that were either parallel to where I was or I had direct contact with.
What are some of the things that you can think of growing up that sort of instilled values in you to get you to where you are today? And the reason why I ask that is because we both come from African households, right? So it's all about, work hard or study engineering and be a doctor, or be a lawyer, or, try and be a moral citizen, all the different values that were instilled in you kind of growing up. But I want to understand what those values were and where you got those from.
Yeah, it's hard to nail one source, but I definitely think there was a value of, I wouldn't say just working hard, but I'd also say of, I don't know how to kind of phrase this, but it's almost like, building for others or building things for the benefit of others. I think that comes largely from like my parents' backgrounds, both, at some point working in the civil service, either here or abroad. The idea that there's a strong element of service. And I think that directly influenced a lot of my own career choices, definitely. And I think that even to this day, it's something, service is an important part of, I guess, some of the values that I hold, and I look to reflect them in my working life. It doesn't always get you paid the most. I give it that. I love to be a bit more cutthroat sometimes, but there is space. There's space for kind of all modes of being. Isn't just about being one thing, but definitely, I'd say the notion of the values of service and service for the greater good is something that's definitely given to me by family and the upbringing I had anyway.
Yeah, no, that's quite interesting. Speaking of service, actually, so fast forward, let's say you graduate from high school. How did you get into the sort of entrepreneurship accelerator space? Was this something that you started off doing once you started in the workforce, or did you gradually come upon this at some point where you met someone, or how did it happen?
So it was a range of different things, if I'm honest, several factors which kind of came together. I would say after I graduated, that just by chance, I think I had this job. And at the time, it was like working for, it was like GE Money Home Lending in their debt recovery department.
That sounds sexy, man.
It was everything you could imagine. But I remember working there, I was dealing with complaints all day. The only time I'd speak to a member of the public was a complaint. And obviously, we're talking about mortgages here. So subprime mortgages, not just any good mortgage. But I do recall learning several skills that, I can be good on my feet when talking, that if anyone throws something at me, I can handle it. I can negotiate with angry people. Because you're speaking to, up to 100 people per day, from your desk. So I think realizing I had that skill set, and I'd spent the next few months living in Ghana. as a young man. It's my first experience.
Still a young man.
Yeah,
come on.
well, yeah, a younger man. But that was my first experience living on the continent. And I went initially for a work placement, on the continent, on the African continent, solo. Previously it was all family. So that's a very different experience.
Yeah.
But anyway, after that, coming back to the UK, feeling a bit lost. And then I did some volunteering, and the volunteering was for a charity which was focused on business education. And they put me on the spot to really kind of speak about, I think I was even asked to speak about the importance of business in the world, something so random and so general.
Yeah.
And they put me on the spot. They were like, great, do it. I spoke, and it was kind of, it went well. And they were like, have you ever considered coming to work with us? We're going to go around schools and colleges and speak to young people who at that time I wasn't that much older than. And did that for a few years. I then left that role. I met some great people. But that opportunity was initially voluntary, and I realized that really did change my life, and it leads indirectly here. After that, I went to work for a startup, which was an early stage social network. I guess a bit of almost like a combination between kind of Facebook, LinkedIn, and meetup.com, what we know as meetup.com.
Wow, this must have been really early. You're talking like pre-Facebook and all these.
Oh no,
like
it was definitely Facebook was around, but they weren't as integrated in our lives as they were as they are now.
Yeah,
definitely not. There was space for rivals. Now it just seems like who would start a rival organization.
Yeah.
But I went to work for that organization, and it was great. I met some fantastic people I'm still friends with today. Learned all about the issues of scaling any business, and the idea that some businesses are great in theory, but ultimately unscalable. And having that experience then led me to working for an accelerator, actually. So getting my first kind of opportunity. And initially it was an accelerator which was based out in Ghana. So come full circle. So Ghana was where I went first, and I'm back again.
Yeah.
And that was really focused on early stage businesses, but this time women or female led businesses in Ghana. Had a great experience there. It was interesting working on the ground because, it's a multi-stakeholder project. So you're not just working with the founders, you've also got to work with donors and funders and all that kind of international development sector requirements. And on returning to the UK is where I worked for an accelerator called Velocities, based outside of London, but focused on sustainability. And a few years there led me to where we are today, which is Startup Discovery School. So it was it's been a decade, if I'm honest, a decade journey. And I think service has been a big part of that, serving both the founders that we work with in the right way, but also providing them the tools to succeed. And ultimately Startup Discovery School came out of almost a pain point, realizing, if we're honest, the founders I met over the last few years have generally been, there's generally a game to play. Being African means that I know the game. Having parents that are very ambitious, regardless of ability, the ambition is high. And, recognizing that they wanted us to do the best, go to the right university, go to the right schools, because that got us into the system, as it were, the rubber stamp. And I see a lot of parallels with what entrepreneurship is now. You can almost game the system, and that means that certain people lose out. So if you don't have the right stamps, the right schooling, the right university, the right connections, you just never get your chance. And that's where Startup Discovery School came in. That's where we really hit. We thought, hey, we know great founders who don't fit the mold. Can we support a more diverse entrepreneurship space? Can we provide that kind of bridge towards long-term success? Because we hear about the early successes. We hear about some great founders, but it's that chasm they need to cross. That's where we come in, and our program aims to support them on that journey.
You touched on something there that's pretty interesting for me, which is the fact that I thought before getting into sort of the tech space, accelerators, VC, all this stuff, that it was very egalitarian in the sense that the best ideas would always win. And then you figure out that you can game the system if you have the right schools or if you have the right backers or if you have the right founders, that could be enough momentum to really propel people to a certain position. And I kind of didn't really like that. And I've always been curious as to how we can, I don't want to say democratize it, but ensure that the best ideas win, not necessarily the most connected people, but maybe that's a bit of a kumbaya kind of way of thinking, because at the end of the day, no matter what industry you're in, you still have to create a network, and there is an element of it's who you know. But I think they're trying to change that because it sort of reinforced certain, I don't want to say biases, but biases or certain molds, and it didn't give room to other people that were non-traditional or didn't fit that mold, who probably had really good insights into a particular industry or way of thinking and things like that. Do you see that shift happening now, where because you as an entity, Startup Discovery School, are making that change and others are doing it with you, or is it still just kind of you're the canary in the coal mine saying, hey, we need to change this, and everyone's like, check these guys out, what are they talking about? You know what I mean?
No, I wouldn't say we're the canary in the coal mine, but I would say definitely that there is a change. There is obviously a lot of people working very hard to change this, and I do think it's about firstly recognizing limitations. What can't we change? What things are totally out of our control? And if we're going to talk about, I guess, democratizing entrepreneurship, it's a very complex topic and it's multifaceted. So at one end, you could say, okay, we're going to have more investors we're going to diversify the investor body. So we're going to have people from different backgrounds, because the theory going that if we have a kind of more diverse investor body, then we'll have more diverse entrepreneurs because they'll be identifiable. But that itself won't solve the problem as per se, because you're still faced with a fundamental problem that typically the entrepreneurs who are emerging are those that have generally benefited from the best education. There are some outliers, of course. We can point to the outliers, but generally speaking, that's the rule. Someone said online that recently to me that, I think there's a lot of chat online about hardship, how hardship is great, how hardship produces the best. You want to see more entrepreneurs who've been through hardship. And I've got a brother who works in the homeless support sector, and he says to me, I wouldn't wish anyone to go through what some of my clients have been through. Mental health issues, unstable family, unstable housing. And I think sometimes that's been fetishized in the sense that we want hardship. Hardship is not, I've turned down a tier 1 job for a tier 1.5 job.
Oh, that is goodness me, how will you survive?
Yeah, let's be real for a second here. Stable education, home, access to resources, more consistently produces entrepreneurs. Those factors, and not limited to those factors, that consistently produces high quality entrepreneurs. That's why we fight for those things, because we know those are the key differentials.
Yeah.
We can have our outliers, and I think it's important that we do have role models. I'm not trying to discount that, but I do think in terms of if we want a more consistent pipeline of entrepreneurs, is those things which are ultimately education, access to STEM, access to support, leveling the playing field for access to certain school courses. And all those things are conversely outside the control of the entrepreneurship ecosystem. Yeah. So that's where I say, we have to recognize our limitations. And, that work is about partnership. It isn't just about we're going to get more, black and brown investors. That is part of it, but it's not the whole. And I think if we can recognize that, then we can at least have an honest conversation about the next steps. You can say, okay, this is a generational thing. I can have conversations my parents could have never have had. It's generational, right? It's like I can, and the same way, if I was to have children, they can have conversations which I can never approach. So there is that kind of patience which is needed, but also direction of travel. I do think there definitely is a direction of travel, especially in light of everything that's happened in 2020.
There are times I feel very impatient with the pace of change, and for good reason, because when you think of what you thought 2020 would be back in the year 2005 or whatever it is, forget even the flying cars and all that kind of stuff. We haven't even solved these issues of creating ecosystems for people to invest in the right things. Forget, the amazing inventions they thought we'd have. But I'm always, reminded of back in the civil rights movement in America, when within the space of a week of riots or things happening, they passed legislation and civil rights were passed. So it's almost as if things can move quickly if people really want to do things. I mean, it took us how many months to figure out, a COVID vaccine. Meanwhile, the typical, life cycle to get a vaccine is decades. When people really want to do something, they can actually get it done. But I think that there's a political cost that could come to those that are a bit impatient and push too much for it, because you're exposing yourself, you're going against the mold. People want to just do it gently, not to, go against the establishment and things like that. Do you ever encounter this?
Yeah. And as we become more engrossed in the system, as you find that to go fast, you're limited in your ability to go fast. It's natural as you make more contacts, as you become more of a kind of voice.
Yeah.
There is a limitation on how much you can really push. And I think that's a natural consequence of being involved in any sector. You know, you could say it. And that's why you need outsider voices. You need those rebel voices who can say, hold on, why do we do it this way? And I think it's right to feel impatience. And I think my dad used to say to me, he used to have this saying, whenever we'd go high-minded, he used to turn around and look at us. And I remember he'd look over the top of his glasses and say, yes, Gosbert, our people need to eat now.
Forget the future, man. I'm trying to live now.
Yeah, and I used to be quite disdainful of that view. But again, maybe it's an age thing. As I've gotten older, I'm like, there is a room for ruthless pragmatism. We need to eat now. It's okay talking about 10 years, but right now there's a problem. And I used to serve as a college governor for a number of years. And I remember like the head teacher saying to us, guys, we've got a real problem with access to science courses for some of our minority students. And she'd say, remember, look, we've got kids in the system now. We can't shut down the college for 5 years and get our ducks in order and then come back. Like, there are some short-term measures we have to take. And it's not it's not a perfect solution, but it's good enough for right now. And I definitely think there is space for that in the entrepreneurship ecosystem specifically. I think it's great that we've got more internships, work placements, access. You've got people like Included VC doing amazing things. And I think it's okay to say, you know what, we're playing a part in the solution. We are not the solution. Because ultimately we're going to end up disappointed. If we put the faith in any entity like that, say you guys are going to sort this out, tell us when to go. I think I'm learning. I'm learning because, you know, I'm an idealist at heart. That value of kind of service does mean I tend to lean towards idealism, which sometimes can make me a bit unpragmatic.
Yeah. I mean, to a certain extent, I'm an idealist as well, but I think we need people like that because without those, everyone falls into pragmatism to an extent that never allows us to dream of what could the future look like. And I think that's definitely an important part of the ecosystem. So don't sell yourself short in that regard. But I wanted to touch on something you mentioned a bit earlier, which is the rebelliousness.
Yeah.
I've always noticed that the best entrepreneurs went against the grain or against the mold, right? Let's do something different, or they wanted to fight the system to a certain extent, right? But how exactly do you foster rebelliousness or people going against the mold, but protecting them from the consequences of going against that mold? What you're trying to do at your accelerator is not traditionally done. The ideas that people are bringing to your accelerator are against what the traditional norm is in that particular sector. How do you think we can create a safe space for people to be rebellious, maybe even particularly minorities or people that are not used to being viewed as risk takers? So to give an example, imagine someone from Stanford drops out. That's a normal thing, right? Because it's okay for a Stanford person or Stanford student to drop out and try something new. He's rebellious, but that's a good kind of rebellious versus the other guys. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think part of that, protecting people from the consequences, I'm not so sure we can protect them for the consequences, but we can give people the space to experiment. And I wrote recently in a post that ultimately what we're all trying to do is space. What we all need is space, space to think, to breathe, to be creative, to bring ideas to life. We all need space, and space is at a premium, especially now. Normally we don't have space, especially now during 2020. For a lot of people out there, it's survival. This is about survival. I mean, for a lot of businesses, this isn't about the year of growth. Well, unless you're certain businesses, logistics, those guys are doing numbers. But for a lot of businesses out there, it's about you just need to see 2020 through and probably half of 2021. I think what we can do is give people space. I think if we're going to protect people from the consequences, it's space to really think things through, space to experiment, space to talk to potential customers, talk to the right customers, talk to the wrong customers, talk to customers they can't hope to service ever. I think if we can provide that, I think that is the most valuable commodity. And the space requires a mix of everything. It's time, clarity of thought, space to be someone else. Some of the founders we meet perhaps have been working for a long time in particular sectors. This is it could be their first foray into entrepreneurship. There needs to be space that we can reimagine ourselves as founders. There's a lot of talk about founders this, founders that. I mean, anyone could be a founder, really, obviously, and there is no kind of template. I think typically there is a template that does exist, whether it's written down or not. But yeah, I think maybe not protect people from the consequences to answer your question, but we can provide them with space, which ultimately is the key commodity that we're finding. Some of the founders we work with, if we can just give them that breathing space, I think that is probably the greatest gift. Yeah, I'm harping on something which I think is the biggest part of space, which is the economic background and the freedom to pursue things because of the consequences being limited. So for instance, if you know that you own your home outright, that gives you mental space to try things, because if you fail, you still got a roof over your head. Without that, you're really struggling. And I remember a statistic showing that African Americans or Black people have the lowest percentage of home ownership in the UK, and that persists in other different factors as well. But that space, how are you guys trying to consciously create this in what you're doing? Is it just the economic part of it, and is that the biggest part of it, or other things?
So it's two things. It's in our model. We labeled it as school, Startup Discovery School on purpose, because the word school evokes both good and bad memories, but also it signifies a need to learn, but not to kind of teach a relationship. But we wanted to take that journey that we're all going back to school and all going back on the journey, and that seeps through into everything. We have to understand that most people haven't got 6 months to a year where they can just take off and try stuff. Obviously, they say you should start young when you've got least responsibilities, but there's a big middle before you get to kind of perhaps older age. Most people have responsibilities, they have family responsibilities. We've had founders who are perhaps the main breadwinner in their homes. Perhaps they're looking after parents, paying for relatives to go to school abroad. These are the type of conversations which don't normally happen in accelerators, but I think they're an important part of the conversation. We had a founder who said, I need to renegotiate terms with my most important investor. And I was like, you got investment from who? Because it's my wife. So, okay.
Okay. We've done the most important investment.
Yeah. We've done a deal. We're taking a financial hit here for a specific period of time. She's expecting me to alleviate her of that sole responsibility in 6 months. We need to have that conversation. Those are the conversations which don't normally happen. And I think even from our program design at all levels, we are looking, for example, most of our engagements with our founders are concluded in the evenings, or early evening at least. We're also aware of the industry we're in, where we're typically, what you hear about are aggressive fundraising deadlines and big raises. I think we have to consciously, I won't say push back against that, not at all, but we also have to it's taken us a journey to redefine what we see as success. And there's a problem with that, because we both, me and my co-founder have both worked in the sector. So we know what kind of success, we know the trigger points. We know we've almost had to divorce ourselves from that to recognize that some founders will take their journey to success may not look like a 10x or 100x. It could be just running a sustainable business, And there's no shame in that at all. I think sometimes social media has made that shameful. Someone's not super ambitious. It's like, what are you doing? So, but that's been a journey for us, because we have to kind of reshape. We can't be out here talking about, we want to diversify entrepreneurship. We want to see more non-traditional founders, but still play by the old rules. It's kind of flawed. It's like, when's your exit? So what do you mean exit? This person doesn't want an exit. I want to do this forever. Obviously, we can offer our perspective and say, okay, you need to have a succession plan. But it's not about kind of trying to force that on, onto anyone. I had this great experience where I was in the barbershop and I was talking to my barber, and I was like, you guys need to take, iZettle, you need to get these contactless payments. Do you know what can? And I was given a full blown economics lecture.
Oh yeah.
To the guys in Finsbury Park. I was like, more money means a better shop, perhaps even appointments for all of us.
Yeah.
A cleaner shop. And these guys own the shop, because as Finsbury Park becomes increasingly gentrified, these guys can't last because they don't have no ownership. And I was pretty proud of myself. The reaction I got was like shrug their shoulders, like,
what's this guy on about?
Yeah, what's he on about? Firstly, all your plans require some sort of paper trail.
We don't need those.
We don't need none of that. So I was like, we don't want 10 of these shops.
Yeah.
I'd presented my plans for we can get one here. You guys, in 5 years, you guys could be, the cover of Forbes. They were just like, no, I'm happy with this. This job gives me enough to kind of live on and to provide for my family. I'm a respected member of the community. I like the environment. People come here all the time. What's the problem here?
Yeah.
So it's taking me just a bit. You have to sometimes check yourself and always think, okay, well, like I said, we're not here to force our own success metrics, but we are here to have the honest conversation, and we will always lay out to some of the founders we work with for the vision that you have of this business. Okay, in our opinion, this is the requirements, this is the roadmap. This is what that roadmap looks like. And if someone says, look, I just want to ensure that I'm doing something consistently that I love, and I might have no ambition to be global or whatever, then that's fine. I think that we can have those conversations up front. previously, we couldn't have those conversations because this, what we're in, it's like, it's not big enough for us, etc.
I feel like the barbershop is the perfect accelerator incubator space for people to come up with unique solutions for the Black community and things like that. There's actually a company that was valued at 200 and something million.
Yeah, I just saw those guys.
Yeah, you saw that? It was amazing. I was like, who would have ever thought about that? You know what I mean? A software to manage your barbershop, but you needed someone that had that mindset, which you had, which was, how do we scale this? How do we do this to solve that particular need in that space? And I think that, we need more of those types of things in certain communities, even beyond the Black community. It could be, Middle Eastern or whatever it is, but there are opportunities to solve problems that could potentially scale that people aren't seeing.
Yeah, and often problems you're confronted with every day, but you don't necessarily see them as problems because they're just part of, the efficient. If I'm saying I'm going to the barbershop, I clear out my entire day.
Yeah.
When you coming back? Who knows?
God knows. Yeah,
exactly. But I'm going to learn something.
Yeah,
because either someone's going to be quoting the Bible at me and telling me this,
or selling their mixtape or something.
That's all part of the experience. I'm going for an event, even if time is tight. I've almost kind of preempted it because I know, okay, if you need to go somewhere on a Sunday and look neat and tidy, you don't go get a haircut on Saturday, the busiest day. Yeah. He's going on Thursday.
Yeah, exactly.
He's going to Thursday. So it's interesting, the problems that we're very close to, but we don't necessarily see as problems. We just see it as part of the experience,
I wanted to touch a little bit on the sort of Ghana experience. I mean, not to go back too far, but being a founder or working in the Ghanaian context versus working in the UK context, there's a whole different class of materials, mindset, resources, you name it. What are some of the biggest challenges you've seen to the work you did while you were in Ghana or in the continent, which, by the way, is really taking off? I mean, Rwanda and a few places are doing really well.
Yeah, of course.
But what do you see happening there? What gives you hope? Is there a discernible difference between there and the UK?
Yeah, so in our work at Startup Discovery School, we've been lucky enough to have a lot of contact with founders based on the continent, particularly in West Africa, or let's say Anglophone Africa. I think from what we've seen so far, I think there are challenges and opportunities. I think from our own personal perspective, it does take us stepping back just a little bit, because I think the tendency can be to see, we're here in a developed entrepreneurship ecosystem and dictate and think, okay, well, we know the solutions. If any kind of African founders, and I realize Africa, 54 different countries, hundreds of languages. Yeah. I'm using Africa as a catch-all term.
Full disclaimer out there.
Huh? There can be a tendency to say, well, we've got it here. We know exactly what the problems are on the continent. And I think there is a bit of unlearning we've had to do to recognize that there are kind of the nuances, idiosyncrasies that, the African startup scene has, and it's very regional in that sense. But it's definitely opportunities. I mean, countless kind of issues to be solved. We've had a lot of contact with companies in the logistics space, particularly in Nigeria, and just to hear their pitches and the stories and everything it's been incredible. To hear about the inefficiencies, but also to understand these are part of a structure. It isn't as if people do not have the answers. And I think that's something we've had to humble ourselves with, that it's not as if people don't have the answers to these. There is always things attached around any problem. And I think definitely see a huge amount of opportunity, but just in terms of hunger, I think tech has been a great leveler. How can someone based in Abuja today who's built an early MVP get traction across a continent? It's incredible. We've had, a number of alumni who've come through our program, but in particular, we've got someone in the payment system, Way Your Money, who are doing cross-border payments in the continent. And, their pitch was quite simple. You all know how to send money to the African continent. Like, yep, we do on a regular basis. And he said, okay, great, but how do you send money intra-Africa? What's that like? And I was like, I don't know, like, what is it about? How difficult is it to send money from Kenya to Senegal? And he's like, and he gave us an example. He goes, extremely difficult. That's where we come in. That's the solution. But I think for the founder there, who's based most of the time in Accra in Ghana, he's aware of the unique circumstances that exist, that perhaps we have a perspective to offer, of course, but he knows the problem best. And I think that's an example that, oh, wow, I didn't realize I'd only sort of payments and remittances as either coming from or going to the continent, never inside the continent. As much as we use the term Africa, I never think about, the only time I think about kind of Pan-Africanism is during the African Nations Cup football, where you've got like Guinea-Bissau playing Comoros Islands, and you're like, of course, they're completely two different states, thousands of miles apart, different languages, cultures, beliefs, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. But you never see them as what, like, I can imagine, I know there's different, Italy, England, of course, totally different. Yeah. But in Africa, there's that lack of kind of understanding of differences, and for many reasons.
Yeah. I wanted to touch a bit on that difference of context, because we're talking about sort of the UK versus Ghanaian or whatever African context. And in America, the African-American ecosystem for investing or creating an economic structure is very different from what I see in the UK and in Africa. And I don't know if it's because they've had such a shared history that has forced them to unify and create these economic bases when they didn't have other platforms available to them. I believe there was like a Black Wall Street at some point that unfortunately got burned down and things like that. But they had things like the United Negro College Fund and all those economic incentives or bases that they created for themselves. I haven't really seen it being translated, or at least it's just starting to get translated over to the UK or in Africa. Why do you think that is, in terms of the difference of Black entrepreneurship from one context or one continent to the other?
I think, I've been thinking about this a lot actually, and debating it quite a lot with friends and contacts. I think there's a very different journey when it comes to, the African-American journey and the Black British experience, which in itself, the Black British experience is divided into kind of several subgroups. You have people say things start at the Windrush generation, the migration of people from the Caribbean to the UK to work in the services here post-war, World War II. But there was definitely a presence of Black people prior to that, maybe not in any significant number. You then have the Heathrow generation, which I call mum. And
what's that?
Those are the kind of the African students who arrived in the 70s, post IMF, World Bank, economic, reconstruction in their country.
Generation?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of a name for them. Like they arrived in the kind of 70s to kind of early 80s. A lot of people from Nigeria, from English-speaking Africa, came to the UK as students, and I think that kind of journey, and even most recently, you had a large influx of kind of Somali people in the early 90s, Zimbabweans and Southern Africans in the 2000s. Like it's a very complex, even though it's all Black British, it's a very different, fragmented kind of population base with cultures, religions, languages. It's all a mix. I don't think we have that kind of common shared maybe experience in the same way that perhaps the African-American story has. And even in the United States, you have African-Americans, but you also have people of African heritage who are born in the United States who do not identify as African-Americans. But I definitely recognize, and this isn't necessarily, someone else said this recently, that there is an amazing level of soft power in African-American culture, which perhaps Black British culture doesn't have. African-American culture is exported. What we see, it's in movies.
Like sports, like basketball.
Movies, so even in sitcoms, the first prominent Black people I saw on TV, my earliest memory was like, Will Smith, Fresh Prince, Cosby Show, Hanging with Mr. Cooper, my wife. Like those were extremely influential.
Yeah.
I want to go to the United States. I was like, wow. And if you remember that, for example, that was a very kind of middle class African-American families who'd done well for themselves. Yeah. It was almost aspirational. They weren't the same. There wasn't the equivalent Black British kind of equivalent at that time. So I definitely think they've just had a different kind of journey and shared experiences perhaps which we haven't had in the UK in the same way. I do think Black Britishness is more common now, and we are seeing the emergence of such initiatives. We had Lendo, Kwanda, who are taking the kind of loan systems which a lot of kind of migrants and Caribbean communities used years ago and translating them now for a new generation. So that is coming slowly, but it's just been a very different journey, very, very different journey, which perhaps doesn't have the coherence of the African-American narrative.
Yeah. So what gives you hope for the future? I mean, what does 10 years from now look like for you as an individual, but even for the ecosystem at large? What are you looking forward to?
I think I'm looking forward to seeing the emergence of kind of more, especially from the ecosystem, more micro investors. I think we're underestimating the impact that, access to capital can have, especially when I say micro, I'm not talking about huge investment levels.
Yeah, what do you mean by micro?
So, typically when we talk about raises, people start at 6 figures. If you want to be taken seriously, as a founder.
There's not a mill. I don't want to deal with it. Yeah.
But I think we're underestimating the impact that 20,000 has. In the latest report written by the British Business Bank, so not the left-wing think tank, they said that minority founders are penalized through, I think it was something, there was a good quote they had, I can't remember it exactly, but it was something like the lack of integration they have within investor networks and the pervasive impact of wealth. And it was like, sharp. That's the British Business Bank saying that.
Yeah. So it's legit.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, okay, easy guys. I didn't expect, I was like half expecting you to kind of ignore everything and then you come back with, these guys. It's like, oh, okay, I agree with you.
Yeah.
So I think we're underestimating the impact or the accessibility of capital, the lack of accessibility to capital, because it can kill most good ideas. Of course, you can bootstrap, but you've
got to have boots to strap in the first place.
Hey,
man.
Exactly. Yeah, that's good. Some people haven't got boots.
Exactly.
As my dad says, our people need to eat now.
Exactly.
So I'm looking forward to seeing definitely the emergence of a more diverse investor base, and also the emergence of more minority and black founders across a range of different disciplines. I think if we can increase access to kind of education, a lot more work's being done and kind of, they say that decision, if you're going to be a kind of technical founder, it often means that you've studied a STEM subject. But there was a great report written recently saying that most technical founders, that kind of filtering out is your gateway, is ultimately, let's say, a science subject. But the decision to put you onto a science degree or pathway is made at like 12. This is early. It isn't a kind of, obviously you've got your outliers, of course, but a lot of people are filtered out. And I think a lot of the work that's being done now through some of the organizations you mentioned, I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that. So more diverse investor base, more diverse kind of entrepreneurship base, and more diverse kind of founder coming across, perhaps who's got experience in sectors which predominantly they're not typically seen in. So having worked in an accelerator which focused on environmental sustainability, I reckon out of probably about 50 founders, I can count probably 2 minorities. And less than probably the same for women, even if you look at it that way.
Wow.
I think 10 years from now, that looks like a very different kind of, a very, very different pool of both entrepreneurs, makers, creators, and investors. And that's something that gives me definitely hope. I think there's some good foundations being put in right now. Like, if you look at someone say, oh, what's the impact of a weekend hackathon? But I'd ask, like, what are you comparing that against? And are you underestimating the accessibility a hackathon provides for a handful of people over 24 or 48 hours?
Even just the train of thought, exposing someone to other things that they haven't seen might spark something that ends up becoming something huge. In fact, a lot of R&D that happens around the world, oftentimes it's done without a particular goal in mind, because some of the best inventions have come out of serendipitous research, and it was like, oh, this is an application for it. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think the internet was ultimately the result of a military application. It was, to help them, and then they're like, well, we could use this commercially, right? And then it expanded into this thing that has dominated our lives. But man, we could speak for days. I know we're getting towards the end of it. Real quick before we end, so if there was any advice you could give to your younger self, let's say the 20-year-old that was in the barbershop getting the lineup about to go out to see a Will Smith concert, if those existed, what would you say to that person? What are the 2 or 3 pieces of advice you'd give to that person?
I think, there's probably 2 or 3 bits of advice I'd give. One would be to start, because I don't think most things in life, you're never ready, You often start, learn on the way, you get some mentors, people that like you will say, hey, what you're doing is interesting. You don't have to have all the answers. I think that's one thing. You do not have to have all the answers to start something. Like you said, the internet came from people experimenting. Half the entrepreneurs we work with, it's exactly the same thing. Also, another piece of advice that I'd give, I'd encourage myself to start pitching early. And by pitching, I don't just mean formal pitching. I mean sharing my ideas. I think I spent a lot of time kind of, hiding, like, don't tell people what you're doing. Yeah. And not even in a sense that people might steal it, but it may not be good enough.
Yeah.
I think I'd encourage that a lot more. I met some great founders over the last few years, and just in general, people who will pitch half an idea with such conviction. That's very African to me.
The natural sellers.
Man. I think that you learn that, I used to say about my dad, I say the African dad has conviction about things he has no idea about. So if you ask them, what do you think about astrophysics?
Yeah.
Son, let me tell you about astrophysics. Complete conviction.
Yeah.
So yeah, pitching from early. And finally, I think that final bit is it's okay not to have a plan, which sounds a bit contradictory because we're constantly talking about plans like, so what are your plans for the next 6 months?
Yeah.
But it's okay not to have a plan. I think there's a huge pressure to have everything in line. So I'm always surprised about the emails I get sometimes from interns who say, I don't know what my passion is or my purpose or anything like that. And I'm like, hey, I'm still, it's a continuing journey. And Startup Discovery School is something we're passionate about and we love doing. But at the same time, I know it won't last forever. Like this same passion won't last. There'll be a time where it's time to make a change. And that may be taking a different role, perhaps being a bit more distant, doing something else completely. So
starting a podcast.
Yeah. It's like, being open. Like we met via social media, that great platform. People badmouth social media, but it connected us. And I think, just not being open to kind of the possibilities, but not being scared of not having a plan. I think when you're not tied to having a plan means you're not tied necessarily to having an outcome. Obviously, there is time for that. There's a time to say we're gonna get this across the line. Like you emailed me saying, could you meet me here at this time? Yeah. I can't be if it happens, it happens. Oh, see, you can't really. Yeah. And obviously, there's definitely a space for that, but definitely, I'd encourage myself not to be hindered by a lack of destination in mind. Often we're working backwards all the time.
Enjoy the journey.
Enjoy the journey. And it's a long journey.
Doesn't feel that way.
Yeah. Sometimes you're like, is this still going on? When am I going to arrive?
Yeah, exactly. When do I get there? When does that billion get into my account?
Yeah, of course.
But hey, man, thanks so much for being on the show. How can people reach out to you if they want to get in touch?
Hi, I want to thank my parents, first of all, for their foresight here. It's really easy to get in touch with me. Okay. If you're on social media, just at Gosbert, at GOSBERT. Across all platforms. So
fantastic.
Just give me a shout. Usually, if not taking pictures, but also debating. I love to engage. I think social media, we get the most out of it when we actually engage, and I'm a big fan. So feel free to shoot any questions across. You can hit us up at startupdiscoveryschool.com if you want to see what we're doing. But other than that, get me on social media. I always respond.
Fantastic. Cheers.